Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do some work this week on the hero's journey. Last week, towards the end of the week, I caught this video by the Critical Drinker. Now, those of you who don't know the Critical Drinker's YouTube channel, he does movie reviews, and I think his movie reviews would be familiar to many in the Jordan Peterson audience because there's a considerable overlap between the Critical Drinker's ideas and desires and the work of Jordan Peterson. I think that part is quite obvious. It was Rick who introduced me to the Critical Drinker. Now, the Critical Drinker does movie reviews, for those of you who don't know, and the Critical Drinker's videos are laced with profanity. So for my religious audience that does not appreciate profanity and immediately turns off videos that have profanity in them, this video will have profanity in them, not from me, but from the Critical Drinker. So if this offends you or you have trouble with that, there's your trigger warning. It's right there. Now, the Critical Drinker takes on the persona of a cynical, old before his time man who has lost patience with a lot of what is going on in the world. But of course, the person represents himself as a terrible human being, and so it's all sort of part of the game with a Scottish accent of sorts. It's not too different from, let's say, Mr. Plinkett, who, Mr. Plinkett had these reviews of movies, and Mr. Plinkett is also sort of a depraved character who goes through and does movie reviews, and some of his movie reviews, in-depth movie reviews. If you think I have long videos, he has hours of in-depth analysis of varieties of movies. Critical Drinker is quite a bit more fast-paced. His things tend to clip along, but I find he does a lot of good work. And this is a theme that he's been working on for a while. Let's just jump into a little bit and then let's talk about it.
Modern movies suck a few weeks back. I kind of pictured it as when I made my first video about why modern movies suck a few weeks back, I kind of pictured it as a one-shot deal, a chance to vent my spleen about something that's been irritating me for some time now.
Now, I've watched enough of his videos. For the most part, it's his monologue with very fast little clips of movies involved, and it's fairly captivating to the imagination. The stuff that's going on in front of your eyes kind of keeps your eyes right there, and then the interesting and engaging, the monologue keeps going. Now, we'll probably have to go back to his other video that he talked about too, because I thought that was an excellent video too, but I thought this one might be a good way into the topic.
So I could get back to doing what I do best, forcing hostages to battle to the death in illegal underground fighting tournaments. Wait, what? But the more I thought about it, the more
And that's very much sort of Mr. Plinkett, who always had some poor woman tied up in his dungeon or in his basement. That was sort of the Mr. Plinkett shtick.
Against in illegal underground fighting tournaments. Wait, what? But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realise that the problems with filmmaking today are bigger and more complicated than I could tackle in one video.
And I think they're bigger and more complicated than what goes on the screen in the Hollywood market. I think they, obviously, as the Critical Drinker thinks, too, are connected in with far deeper conversations, especially religious conversations, that we are having as a culture.
Series was needed. A series that could methodically tackle each problem in turn, shedding light on just how fucking shady modern writers are, and exposing their misdeeds for all the world to see. And when it comes to shitty behaviour in modern films, there's few more egregious offences than bringing back established, well-known heroic characters beloved by generations of moviegoers, and systematically degrading, discrediting, and destroying not just who they are now, but everything they once were. Usually...
Okay. So generations of moviegoers, probably not that many generations because movies haven't been around that long. But where he's going to land is on this word deconstruction. I posted a couple of tweets with some clips. I've been posting little clips, not usually of my stuff, but other interesting things that I find. If you're curious about the kinds of things I post on Twitter but don't really want to get a Twitter account, you can find them on my Vanderclips channel because I'll usually archive them there on the Vanderclips channel after I post them on Twitter. But I think the Critical Drinker is onto a lot of the deep conversation in our culture about its religious presuppositions. And that's what this is about in many respects.
Beloved by generations of moviegoers and systematically degrading, discrediting, and destroying not just who they are now, but everything they once were.
Okay, so this is a religious movement. And it's a worldview movement that is in many ways being not only processed, but promoted by the industry that, quite frankly, promoted previous iterations of them.
Usually and destroying not just who they are now, but everything they once were. Usually in a desperate attempt to elevate some cheap, soulless carbon copy replacement that lacks everything which made the original so appealing in the first place. It's a cheap, shitty thing for any writer to do, and yet it seems to be happening at an alarming rate these days. Modern Hollywood likes to refer to this process as deconstruction, mostly because it sounds more palatable than fucking over, but that's
well, that's so there you get a sense of his of how he uses language. But again, deconstruction has become the word of choice with respect to obviously Christian deconversion that has been going on, and the fact that we're using the same word for both things, it's not arbitrary. And it has something to do with, let's say, structuralism or post-structuralism and all these highfalutin philosophical terms. The deconstruction has to do with dismembering the archetypes and the assumptions and meta-narratives of previous generations. And this obviously is supposed to be in the service of betterment, usually in the service of betterment of previously disenfranchised groups. And again, one of my favorite videos that deals with this topic.
My movie interpretation videos. In several of my movie interpretation videos, I've documented the rise of propagandistic patterns in recent storytelling. The new intersectional ideal, coupled with the revolutionary patterns so common in Hollywood tropes, have merged together to create quote-unquote woke stories which use storytelling tools to impose an upside-down pattern of reality.
So Pageau highlighting many of the same things as the Critical Drinker is.
This happens through a desire to counteract the negative side effects of identity, such as exclusion and oppression of margins. And so although the aims are understandable, there are inevitable side effects of going down that line. In order to fight stereotypes and traditional hierarchies, one creates characters and narratives which try to upend and counteract them. But what first looks like just counteracting them becomes mainstream and even expected, creating stories with upside-down stereotypes. So women must systematically beat up men. The exceptional must be better than the rule. The outsider better than the one inside. The margin must replace the center while remaining the margin.
I need you to fix his suit.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be. When it fits a woman.
Things become upside down when by social pressures and strange new taboos, these new counterintuitive stereotypes become an enforced, expected norm. Have practices. There are too many franchises to enumerate, from Star Wars, Men in Black, James Bond, to different comic book characters, video game series, the latest being the new Enola Holmes. Correctional thinkers don't just make up new characters and storylines rather than infiltrate and take over existing ones.
And this is part of what is happening. And so the Critical Drinker, he doesn't point out this, but this is the reason why they are retconning, as it says, these older traditions. You simply take them and you have to redo them. You have to deconstruct them and then reconstruct them in the new way.
By asking this, one ignores how contemporary woke activism is born out of a deliberately parasitic approach to being. The activist type understands that the current narratives are in some respect the vehicles of power and normativity. This plays out in the analogy between the human body and the body politic. And so like a virus can destabilize the human body, so too the ideological parasite will destabilize the body politic. So although one can always, openly oppose, the most powerful tool is by infecting structures and subverting power, thereby acting in complete coherence with the revolutionary worldview. This parasitic relationship is not an accident, but is the very pattern of how they think reality works and what they see as their place in the larger system. Normativity can only be subverted. It can only be deconstructed. I've discussed why postmodern thinkers see themselves as social viruses and infections, so I don't want to go into it too much here. What I mostly want to look at is how there is also a secret solution within this pattern of storytelling. We've noticed how the pattern of replacement has appeared in so many instances, where the main characters, represented as the normative ones, are killed or humiliated, inverted, or replaced. The strangest versions of this are those characters who happily cede their place to others, fitting in the intersectional worldview. So the strategy of those enacting these new story tropes is not so much for woke culture to give us new stories and characters, but to deconstruct and ultimately take over existing cultural forms and stories from the inside.
Okay. And so that's the heart of addressing what Critical Drinker points out right there in the first place. Let's then jump back into him.
Exactly what it amounts to, mostly because it sounds more palatable than fucking over, but that's exactly what it amounts to. But hey, if that's the case, then prepare to be thoroughly deconstructed by the drinker, Hollywood. Now, it would be pretty much impossible for me to cover a subject like this without mentioning the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Remember Han Solo? Remember how he started out as a selfish, cynical smuggler who only cared about number one, but gradually transformed over the course of 3 movies into a smart, resourceful military leader, a brave fighter, a loving protector for Leia, and a hero willing to risk everything to help his friends? Pretty cool, right? So it was kind of...
Okay. Transformation, betterment. If there's one thing that we've been talking a lot about, whether we're sort of in the Vervaeke camp or in the Jordan Peterson camp, it's personal transformation, betterment, wisdom. And so when you look at the story arc of Han Solo, he's self-centered, he's selfish, these things he over time begins to overcome and transcend, and he then embodies character, wisdom, kinds of qualities that we look for. And so then we look at the story arc and we say, oh, this is something that we are paying attention to. Okay, now I want to drop in another conversation. This one from the Jordan Peterson, Lawrence Krauss conversation.
Reason fit, not at the top. Where does reason fit? Not at the top. Attention.
Why do you think there's intrinsic wisdom to something like Genesis?
Why do you think there isn't?
Because
it's 5,000 years old, and probably way older than that.
Yeah, I know, but why are things that are ancient give me insight into human psyche, but they don't necessarily give me insight into profound understandings of the world around me? I think we've
not in a scientific way. They don't. Not in the way that modern science does. They're not.
Okay, so what's happening in these movies? Movies are, I would say, and this is by no means an insight original to me, movies are basically a religious promotional vehicle. And they are promoting particular understandings and assumptions about quality. We can use Sevilla's term, about morality, about the good, about how the world should be structured. And so here Lawrence Krauss is having this conversation with Jordan Peterson about, well, what about Genesis? Well, Genesis teaches us things about this.
That isn't what they are at all. They're not that. They're something completely. Look, here's what they are in some sense. Look, we have an idea that we can rank order literature by depth, right? Because you read a shallow book, someone tells you a shallow story. You read a deep book, and you have a sense of depth.
I have a...
Okay, and now most of us would not say that Star Trek and Star Wars are necessarily deep in this sense, but they do exemplify, they both express and promote particular values within a society about what is good, what is admirable, what ought to be sought.
Yeah, okay, so the deepest stories are religious.
Why?
That's a definition.
Oh, hold on. No,
It's
but
a definition.
You're not allowed to make that definition because I disagree with it.
It's because religious emotions start to be aroused when stories are told at that level. This has nothing to do with propositional belief. It's a definition.
So you're saying that if you're saying, okay, you use the word religion, you tell me that I should use the word awe, which I like better. If you're saying the stories that are deepest are ones that relate to awe, I can understand that. Let me translate what you're saying.
Yes. And this is experiential. Right. And then I would also say awe is a biological instinct, and part of the manifestation of that instinct is the impulse to imitate. It's the impulse to, because okay, so then here's another.
Okay, so you've got these movies, and these movies are giving this the impulse to imitate. And Jordan Peterson has this lovely story that he talks about when he would take his son to the movie theater or watch a movie, and the movie would be scary and his son would be upset, and Peterson would say, watch the hero. Keep your eye on the hero. Now what we're going to take a look at in all of this, and why, because most of what I've said is, I think, obvious to many of you and perhaps not even interesting anymore because it's thoroughly mapped territory, but we do have to take a look at this hero's journey. One of the things that I know John Vervaeke was interested in talking to Jordan Peterson about, probably simply hasn't had the opportunity, but to do some evaluation of the hero's journey and heroism. If you talk to Pageau will be, he'll say, well, the hero's journey is, one particular archetype, but so on and so forth. How can we evaluate it? At the heart of Vervaeke's project is a sense of you're trying to guard against bullshit. What do we mean? Try to guard against parasitic thinking. Would the hero's journey be parasitic? Now some would say yes and some would say no. Another set of videos that I discussed a while ago in the same genre again, like Stories of Old. Like Stories of Old did a series on this, and he weighed in on some of the comments in YouTube when I processed some of these. And his basic assertion is he's sort of opposite Critical Drinker in this, except that he certainly doesn't come off as an activist. He sort of comes off as someone who loves those stories, but in some ways laments that we can no longer believe in them. Whereas the Critical Drinker would be like, he's a total believer in that. Hey, this is what a great story is. I'm not going to talk about religion or anything. Here's a great story. This is a crappy story. This is what we want. Hollywood, give us more of what we want, not what you think we should have. Please stop now giving us your new videos, which have all the same reasons why so many Christian videos suck, because it's just so message based. What do you mean, like these hero stories aren't message based? Well, of course they are. And as we continue to go through the Critical Drinker video, we'll have to talk about why the issues beneath some of the decisions that are being made. Well, let's keep going with Peterson and Krauss here.
Another question. Instinct. And part of the manifestation of that instinct is the impulse to imitate. It's the impulse to, because, okay, so then here's another question. What do we imitate? Well, we don't just copy each other. We don't literally move the same way as the person we're imitating. We see someone that we are in awe of, that we respect and admire, we're gripped by the instinct to imitate.
Now, hero by definition is someone that we are in awe of, that we wish to imitate. Now, currently, unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic, we are doing to first responders and all sorts of other people who have really wonderful, admirable, self-sacrificial jobs like nurses and first responders. And we are plastering them with like signs that say heroes work here. And it's sort of going to have the same function as participation trophies. If you don't use a word selectively, especially cognizant of a hierarchy, the word very quickly loses its utility. When everybody's a hero, then nobody's a hero, because hero actually denotes something within an archetype.
What are we imitating? Well, imagine that we can see that in 5 people. And then those people, they do some bad things, but we ignore those. Okay, we're imitating something central about all of them. That's a spirit. This is a definition. It's a definition, because it's disembodied abstraction. It's a disembodied abstraction of action.
Now, I like this little clip because we have a definition of spirit, and I think it's a pretty good one, but we have to add to it some of the other work that we've done on understanding spirit in the contemporary world, which is something that continues to need more work and rehab.
Spirit, for all intents and purposes. We're really smart. We abstract out the admirable and imitate it. That's also part of the religious process. Exactly that. What is it that's admirable across instances of admirable behavior?
Okay, and I loved this point that Peterson made, and he's been making it fairly repeatedly in a lot of his contemporary interviews, which means it's something that he's thinking about. And I was thinking about this actually because the new Matrix movie came out on HBO Max, and because of my cell phone contract, I have HBO Max. And I enjoyed the first Matrix movie, and with each successive movie enjoyed them less. And then, okay, another one's coming out, I'll probably watch it. And then my wife was like, well, we should probably rewatch the first 3 before we do that. Okay, fair enough. And so I've only gotten to the first 2. We'll see if I actually watch the third, because I watched the Critical Drinkers review on the recent one, and I thought, well, I don't know if I'm going to watch that at all. But one of the realizations I had while watching that first Matrix movie, it's a movie that I've seen it maybe a half a dozen times since it came out. Came out something like 12 years ago. Not a movie that I've watched as often as, let's say, Lord of the Rings, but it's a movie that I've rewatched a few times. And what I realized when I was watching that, having listened to Peterson make this point again and again, is in fact the way memory works. We do remember things, at least in the proximal sphere of appropriation that we can muster. And then we remember hashes or snapshots or low resolution impressions, so that when I rewatched the movie, impressions that imprinted on me to a certain degree were retained, and sort of over time, of course, sort of dissipated a bit. But then when confronted with the reinforcement, there obviously was an upping of resolution, but there was also a reinforming of new information and thoughts and changes in myself that then interacted with the new representation of the movie before me. All of that sounds terribly convoluted. My niece, in one of a family chat thing, an extended family chat thing, posted a picture of my father shoveling snow. And that, for many of us in the family, is a very dear thing, because even when my father was living in a condominium where he no longer had to shovel snow, he would often get out there with his snow shovel to beat the people who were paid to shovel the walk, just so he could have the joy of shoveling the walk. Whereas many of us would say, oh, I'm so glad I don't have to shovel the walk anymore. No, he loved shoveling the walk. and he loved doing it. He was still in some ways a little boy at heart. He enjoyed it. And so that then became this snapshot, this impression of my father that sort of, as the resolution goes up, continues to sort of play out. And what's amazing in this is that, as Peterson says, what we do is we have these impressions, these little snapshots that imprint on us, and we only store just the low resolution thumbnail. But if it's accurate to a degree, and it might be accurate, it might be inaccurate, it gets retooled with new impressions plus the new things that we've learned along the way. And that's part of the quirky things that memory works. This gets into this. So then actually, a couple of nights ago, I was playing Civilization with a couple of my sons, and my wife was watching, because if you're playing communal Civilization, there's a lot of waiting, especially if you're not doing real well in the game and your sons are doing better in the game, and they're off on other continents fighting other battles, and I'm waiting for the turn to tick over. And so my wife was watching something on television about a Hollywood music producer, and Whitney Houston came up. And, of course, Whitney Houston's story, right when I mentioned her name, for those of you who know who she is, at whatever resolution you know about her, impressions come to the fore. Probably, wow, beautiful woman, amazing talent, amazing voice, tragic outcome. And then that will be how you feel about fame. All sorts of things. And then my wife and I were talking about Whitney Houston, and then I think it was New Year's Eve. It got late into the night. We had, all kinds of people in the house still, but they were all out in the hot tub, and this is California after all. And my wife and I were, just kind of staying up, and I thought, let's watch The Bodyguard, Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. And it's a movie that I haven't watched in years and years and years, but I remember watching it. It made a powerful impression on me. I was moved by the love story. I was moved by the Kevin Costner figure. And what I remembered of that movie were impressions, usually emotions, quite vague. I remembered certain pieces of the plot. He had a little dog. He had been in the Secret Service. There was, of course, the big oaf security guard who at some point they had conflict, but eventually he won him over. And there was the chauffeur, and there was the sister. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it's a lovely movie. And so I watched it with my wife, and really enjoyed watching it again. But all of the memories of, because when I first watch it, Whitney Houston's story, of course, hadn't ended, so that all of those things come into there. That's all part of this process that Peterson is talking about, that these impressions and the values and all of these things come together in our lives. It's all done subconsciously, preconsciously, built into us, and then we only recognize it when we come across them within ourselves and are sometimes sort of surprised by that, surprised by the emotion. But all of this stuff is built into this world that Critical Drinker is angry about, its deconstruction and the promotion of what he sees to be a substandard replacement. Now, I'm also old enough now to remember prior generations, my father's generation, not so much my father, because he was aged in a time when Christians didn't watch movies, and so those things weren't really very present in his life, but older generations of moviegoers that were about my father's age, complaining that the generations, the Han Solo and the stories that I grew up with, they were completely substandard to than the past generation of the story that they grew up with. But yet, then I've seen some of those past movies and the present movies, and there's always the issue of imprinting, the time of imprinting that, Star Wars came up, so I've got a special imprint of Star Wars in me, whereas past generations might have Errol Flynn and, other Hollywood figures. But the question then is this abstraction of a religion and a worldview, the likes of which we can sort of try to articulate in terms of values. And he just talked about it. The Critical Drinker just talked about it. We're going to go right back to that clip too. But the values that here Han Solo had this transformation. And the fact that we see it in the movie, the pro-felicity that we have, that we see it in the movie and, oh, be like Han Solo. Now, I'm not going to have a chance to really go into this too far today. I want to come back to this topic tomorrow because part of what we have to look at too is this and the Bible. Because Peterson starts here by saying, hey, Genesis is kind of the mother of all storytelling, okay? The book of Genesis. And so Peterson is making his case to Krauss here.
And we imitate that, a part of the religious process, exactly that. What is it that's admirable across instances of admirable behavior? And we imitate that. And when your child, look, here's an example. This is a good example. Okay. Your kid goes out on the field, hey? And he can zip down and score a goal in soccer. And he's got a pretty good shot at it. But a teammate, and maybe not one that's so good, is really open. And so he passes and the other kid scores. And you're happier about your damn kid doing that than you would, if you have any sense, than you would be if he scored a goal. Because he is embodying the spirit of being a good sport. That's way better than scoring a goal. Okay.
And the spirit of being a good sport, that might not sound like a big deal. But again, the sports are kind of up here, and sports, as Peterson, sports are deeply religious. And people who don't go to church, they're deeply religious about their team. They identify with their team, and they identify with the sport. And if you talk to especially men, but some women too, men will talk about how their involvements in sports was so formative and transformative of their lives. He said, well, this is just ball and goals and symbolism. And Peterson's right. He said, no, it's not just that. We're working on all of this stuff in these little arenas, and it's deeply important.
So that good sport, that's way better than scoring a goal. Okay, so that's a good example of, because if you're smart, and I see parents who do this badly all the time when I go to sports.
If you go to any soccer games,
exactly.
I hate them watching the parents.
Yeah, it's terrible. Because they don't do this, eh? They subordinate the local victory to the character development.
Yeah.
No,
and again, if you go back to previous videos, the character development is all about getting invited to more games, and not just sports games, but the sports qualities are used in business and in relationships, the reciprocity, the having a higher standard than just the game itself. You know, someone else is injured, you take a knee, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The rituals, the customs, all of that is built into there.
They sort of the other way around. They subordinate the character development to the local victory.
I was wondering what you were going to get. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So they're imitating.
They're worst.
It's terrible.
At a sportsman. Oh yeah, I can't stand going.
Yeah, and then you look underneath that. It's like, oh, you have a lot of unrealized dreams, a lot of resentment. You're projecting that all on your child, and that has to do with your unresolved shadow and to the pathology that you had with your parents. And it's like just an endless nightmare going down into that sort of stuff. And you go way down, you find some things down there, and they are really ugly. And that's why you don't like going to those soccer games. And no wonder.
Okay. Back to the drinker. Back to Han Solo.
For me to cover a subject like this without mentioning the Star Wars sequel trilogy, remember Han Solo? Remember how he started out as a selfish, cynical smuggler who only cared about number one?
Not a good sport.
But gradually transformed over the course of 3 movies into a smart, resourceful military leader, a brave fighter, a loving protector for Leia, and a hero willing to risk everything to help his friends.
Someone might put on a Han Solo costume and dress up for Halloween and go to a movie. I mean, this is all deeply religious. This is all deeply formation.
It's pretty cool, right? So it was kind of weird to reconnect with him 30 years later, only to find out he'd reverted to a cynical, self-absorbed smuggler who'd somehow lost track of his own ship, a deadbeat dad who'd abandoned his wife and son, and an incompetent criminal who'd made enemies all across the galaxy.
Now, where might we get stories like that from? People might be getting stories like that from their own father. We could play Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days song about, and Peterson's quite eloquent about this, that, in terms of how many transformations do you have in you? I played that in video a long time ago. Some people have one transformation. They got it in sports in high school, and they stay that person their whole life. That was in the Brett Weinstein video. I wonder if I could see. I get tempted to pull up things like that, even if this is what happens when I don't make a PowerPoint. But I might not have thought of it while I was making the PowerPoint anyway. So others have more transformations in them. And Peterson, just as he was getting back from his illness, was talking actually specifically about his computer skills. How many do I have? How many more transformations, even little transformations, do I have in them? So part of what we're going to have to wrestle with is this question of the hero's journey and sort of the time that it's set in. And at some point, we're going to talk about rom-coms, romantic comedies, because they have the same issue. Rom-coms usually focus on the transformation of infatuation to some sort of consummation in a love affair. And the symbols and practices and rituals of confirmation have, in fact, in our culture continued to shift around. And we've had conversation about those rituals and practices of consummation, those boundary markers. But part of what we have to do with, and part of what movies today want to do, whether they're doing it well or not, is in fact asking questions of what to do when someone peaks in their 20s or 30s or 40s and we meet them in their 60s and 70s and they are cynical and corrupt, and what do we do about decadence? Now, someone might say, we have to represent that. But is the movie the best place to represent that? What, in fact, is the function and role of the movie? Well, a lot of that depends on, what your purpose of making a movie is and what your purpose of engagement in the overall culture is. And obviously, the critical drinker is not happy because in the critical drinker's mind and in many of our minds, what we wanted from Han Solo was that if in fact he did not have another transformation in him, that he could go on in the life after the movie. This is where fan fiction develops. I had that in a recent sermon. That he could continue, in fact, to mature and develop and to become the telos of what the initial transformation that we witnessed was pointing to. And that would be a satisfying story. And if something happened to disrupt that transformation, that would also be an interesting story. But as the critical drinker is noting, what we're getting now is, we're going to put him into a movie now, and guess what? He's corrupt. Okay. What corrupted him? How, because you can have positive characters and you can negative characters. And if you read history, reading history, you'll find all sorts of transformations happening in people as we watch them.
See, the man was well into his 60s by this point, but he was somehow less experienced, competent, and mature than when we first met him.
So there's a break in the narrative of the story because, here he is in his 60s. And part of us wonders, what happened to him in his 60s? How has he changed? How has he developed? Has he gotten better? No, he's somehow lost it. Well, what happened? Well, we're not going to talk about that. Well, why not? Well, we didn't make a movie about that. Well, why not? You're just going to plop him into the movie in this state and not explain? And
all of his experiences, character development, and achievements have been rendered completely moot. Now he has to be constantly helped and bailed out by non-diverse female space Jesus, who has to rescue him from a tense standoff with rival crime lord.
Now, again, you can maybe dismiss this because, he came up liking Han Solo and not Rey. And, he's a patriarchal man. Now, of course, some of the persona that he does these movie reviews with, he's well aware of the critiques, which is why he's got this persona, this character that he uses, because he's already sort of resisting that. Oh, you're going to say he says, that's the character I'm playing, isn't it? But you're still giving voice to, well, you should, and on and on and on we go. But yet there's a point that he's making here that is important to listen to. And this connects with Pageau's point that he made. And it connects with Peterson's point because, well, what vision of the world are you in fact promoting with the choices you make in your movie? I assume it's not all simply mercenary.
I got a bad feeling about this.
And fixes ship when he doesn't know how to do it himself.
What'd you do?
I bypassed the compressor.
Then when she gets captured by incompetent cartoon bad guys and Han and the gang head off to break her out, she instead rescues herself while he gets a lightsaber shoved through his fucking chest by not Darth Vader. What's a fucking great end for the character.
He's also got an excellent movie, an excellent video on what's happened to our villains, because that is also a part of this story.
Or how about Luke Skywalker? You remember him, right? The protagonist who went from a humble farm boy to a heroic adventurer, taking on terrifying enemies, overcoming adversity and losses, and ultimately rising to the challenge to turn Darth Vader back to the light and save the entire galaxy? Remember his thirst for adventure and excitement? Remember how he never gave up no matter how difficult things got?
Okay, now these are all, you could just lay them out as, well, these are things that we value in a person. Stick-to-itiveness, an ambition. All of these things. So these are values that we hold, that we embody in a character, in a story, that we aspire to imitate and emulate. That's what happens in religion.
And remember the compassion and restraint he showed, even if it cost his own life? Yeah, well, now he's a
little bit of Christianity in there too.
Grumpy old man drinking green alien titty milk on fucking craggy islands. Just like Han Solo, he ran away from his life and responsibilities when things got hard, promptly forgot all the lessons he'd learned, and became a bitter, cynical recluse who's sitting around waiting to die.
Now, let's be fair to the movie makers. Heroes fail. Heroes fall. Age changes. And if you look at a character like David in the Bible, you look at the run-up to David becoming king, it's a hero's journey. You look at David as king, you've got the census, you've got the Bathsheba affair. David is not a good father. He should have dealt with the situation with Ammon and Absalom. He had a civil war, and even when his personal cohort was winning the civil war for him, and he's crying, Absalom, my son, and his general has to take him aside and say, if you keep this up, you'll have no army here, because these men just put their lives on the line to save you. But even in that story, look at what the Bible does. Look at the values that the Bible represents. Now, we can talk about the poor job that many churches have done in terms of trying to simplify the Bible and turn it into a children's Bible story morality book, which is almost always a bad copy of the Bible, because the biblical stories, as Jordan Peterson noticed, just seem going so deep that the Bible actually manages to not only have a hero and even show what age does to a hero, but not lose the ideals, okay? And yet understanding that all these, the Bible does not really deal with heroes in many of this sort of triumphalistic ways that many Hollywood films do, such as the Star Wars movies. Yet there's more going on there. The Bible is actually able to show the decadence in a way that doesn't do exactly what the critical drinker is complaining these Hollywood screenwriters are doing.
He won't help anyone, he won't try anything, he won't leave Craggy Island, and he doesn't want non-diverse female space Jesus to try anything either. He's got nothing to teach her, nothing to inspire her, and he even gets beaten and humiliated by her in a lightsaber fight. He hates his legacy, he hates the Jedi, he hates himself. He's the epitome of bleak, hopeless, nihilistic futility, and he's the exact polar opposite of everything the original Luke Skywalker represented. The intended messages in both cases is pretty clear. The heroes that you used to look up to will ultimately end up failing, regressing into their old ways, and letting you down.
And again, the Bible is not a book that is just simply about hero worship. Family values, the Bible and family values. And I'd often kind of poke at people and say, show me that good family in the Bible. There's a lot of dysfunctional families, but yet the Bible still has this way of communicating and even showing in the midst of them, well, these are actually what good families are made of. And when you feel the poverty of the family that you grew up in, it doesn't have to be physical poverty or financial poverty, it could be relational poverty. There's wisdom here in terms of why that is and why the dysfunction seems to ripple down into the generations.
And to be honest, they really weren't all that good to begin with, so you need to stop looking up to them and just forget about them now. But do you know who is good? Do you know who'll never fail at anything or regress into their old ways because they don't have any, because they don't actually have a personality, or let anyone down? That's right. She's your hero now because she...
And this is where his points, I think he really makes his points, is that, you've substituted for someone else, but all of the criticisms that you might have looked at with Luke Skywalker, they're in spades with this one. And of course, that's been, but you're only picking on her because she's a woman. No, we're going to have a really good example coming up after this.
She's stronger and smarter and braver, and because we say so. Don't question it, just accept the new programming and move on. But it's not like this kind of thing is confined to Star...
Programming? Programming, you said? Oh, one other really lovely clip I reaped today.
I only know about Dungeons & Dragons from my childhood, from my youth.
Okay, so all the people who loved it as kids, and it's like the Stranger Things Netflix audience... that resonance, that demographic, Stephen King,
sure,
all that genre. But the D&D part, all these voice actors were playing like together as friends, and they're voice actors from video games and stuff. So like the guy, every time I shoot somebody in this one game, I hear this guy's voice. He plays D&D with his friends, and they put it on Twitch as a show.
How do these characters in the screen work? We dress up like them. We see them. Earlier in this conversation, Grimm said, your regularly scheduled programming. My regularly scheduled programming. I would sit voluntarily and watch myself be programmed.
And it was... And then, like, part of the show became them going through all the presents that were rolling in, like, from the audience to the show. And it like, gave the hint that, like, something was... It was like there was a portal open and there was something manifesting through it, emerging from it, or whatever. And so, like, that... Witnessing that for me, and then I see these communities gathering in other places. And, like, before Peterson's big comeback... Yeah, when it was the gaping like wound of where'd Papa go, like there was something happening. Everybody was talking Voltron. There was a book that was supposed to be going between like the circling crew and people had written chapters for a book I never saw. But like there's an arc. All the characters in this are arcing. It's like
now. You too can be a character in a YouTube drama.
And we've all been programmed to be audience.
This is it. We've all been programmed to be audience.
Like you go NPC all day and you come home and then you be audience.
You go NPC all day, you come home, and then you play audience.
Like, wait a minute, this is our one life? Is it?
Wait a minute. This is our one life?
This is what we're... like, we don't believe in reincarnation, so we got this one shot, and we spend it NPC and audience? Come on, guys, let's play.
Yeah.
So...
Star Wars, consider Sarah Connor from the Terminator franchise. And I mean the real Sarah Connor, not this small child cosplaying as her. Sarah's one of the greatest action heroes of all time, starting out as a simple waitress working in LA, only to become the target of a murderous time-travelling assassin from the future, and discover that she's destined to give birth to the future leader of the human race.
Pretty heavy, huh?
That's right, Marty, it is. The point here is that Sarah is forced to adapt to her new reality very quickly. She's been thrust into a world of violence and danger that she's completely unprepared for. She's been saddled with the knowledge of the grim future that awaits humanity, and the heavy responsibility of knowing the fate of the human race depends on her survival. When we reunite with her in Terminator 2 about 10 years later, she's completely transformed herself into a kick-ass survivalist. She's physically stronger, she's trained and prepared, but the trauma of her past experiences, combined with her knowledge of the coming war, has left her emotionally damaged and estranged from her son. But when he becomes the target for a brand new and more dangerous Terminator, she's forced to rise to the occasion once again, this time fighting alongside her most hated and feared enemy. And it creates an interesting arc for her character. Not only is she a soldier fighting to preserve a vital asset, but more importantly, she's a mother fighting to protect her son, gradually reconnecting with him over the course of the movie. And that maternal side of her slowly becomes the dominant motivator, like in this scene where she berates the scientist who's destined to create Skynets.
You don't know what it's like to really create something, to create a life. Feel it growing inside you. All you know how to create is death and destruction.
Mom! By the end, she's managed to move past her grief and emotional trauma, save her son's life, and even put aside her mistrust of the Terminator. The movie ends with Sarah looking ahead to the unknown future, ready to meet it with renewed hope and optimism. Wow, what a perfect fucking ending for the character. It'd be a real shame if they totally fucked it up like 30 years later.
And of course, they will. And these changes of the story have consequences in the religious programming of the people that are around today. And I think a big piece, obviously, of the Peterson movement was people who had been programmed into this began to say, no, nihilism is not good for breakfast anymore.
Oh. Not only does John Connor get brutally killed in the first 5 minutes of the movie, thus erasing everything the series has been about up until now, but Sarah herself turns into a bitter, alcoholic old killer, hunting Terminators because she's got nothing better to do.
Okay, so again, age. There's something going on here with respect to this. It's glory days. It's, in some ways, some of the Back to the Future franchise dealt with this in terms of this time difference. Of course, Marty McFly goes back, in sense, to save his father from the underworld before his father actually goes into the underworld. I mean, all these ways that we can play with these themes and these imaginative stories, it's absolutely wonderful. But yet, as Peterson notes, we look at all these stories, and there are many, 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 many stories now, and we abstract out of them that which is admirable.
Has now been replaced as the future saviour of humanity by this diminutive kidlet, and watching her try to talk tough is just the funniest thing ever.
Is that our fate? Well, fuck fate.
And of course, Sarah is completely outclassed in every respect by androgynous thing. See, she's taller and she's got bigger muscles and shorter hair, so that makes her better, right? Oh, and remember that maternal side to Sarah's character that was such a fundamental driving force behind her actions in the previous movie, making her capable of acts of incredible bravery, heroism, and sacrifice? Because really, what's more pure and altruistic than a mother's love for her child? Yeah, that's gone the way of John Connor in this movie. Now she's just angry and resentful that people like her and Danny simply have to give birth to the most important leaders in human history, rather than being the all-powerful leaders themselves.
You serious?
Okay, so right there again, there's things that, in a sense, as a culture, we are trying to work through. Is it the decadence that Ross Douthat points out in his book? Is it that, maybe the people who are in charge of the movie industry now are, in fact, those 60-year-old or 60-year-old late boomers, maybe early Gen Xers, my generation. I'm right on the cusp. That are cynical and, well, what then do you put your faith in? Mindless anger? And this is what he deals with in the previous movies, and I look forward to more of the movies from this series.
You know, as I sift through the endless river of sludge that passes for modern entertainment, I'll occasionally come across an unexpected gem glistening in the murky depths. Like Dune, for example, which proved to be a thoughtful, slow-paced and philosophical adaptation of some pretty challenging source material. But one thing that leapt out at me while I was watching it was, holy shit, isn't it nice when characters act like smart, mature adults who make sensible decisions, control their emotions, and actually take the time to consider their situation instead of ridiculous hyperactive teenagers driven by hormones and emotions that have somehow inherited the bodies of grown adults.
And have somehow inherited our culture.
It seems like some kind of crazy luxury from a bygone era now, but it brought me to a pretty interesting conclusion about why modern movies suck harder than Tatiana after 2 lines of cocaine. They're written by children for children, or rather, people with the intelligence, attention span, and emotional maturity of children.
And it would be nice to suggest that it's that deficiency that is behind this, but I don't think so. And that's a much scarier thought, that in fact, there's sort of an attempt, and I think we've seen this culturally, I think we've certainly seen this politically, there's sort of an attempt to say, no, this reactivity is what ethics, and this is the character that we should possess, because that's what we're watching on TV in terms of the leaders of our culture. That's how they are, aren't they?
And this fundamental limitation filters through into everything they produce, which is fine if your idea of entertainment is eating Play-Doh and farting in the bathtub, but for anyone looking for something just a bit smarter and more subtle, it's a bit like going to a burlesque show, except the dancers all look like Elizabeth Warren, and they want to spend the evening talking to you about federal tax reform.
But, in all fairness, there's a swipe that will make some people upset. But hey, you can paint Trump in terms of some of this as well. I mean, talk about behaving like a child on a public stage. And I know I've just got in trouble with some of you for that, but there's my opinion.
Anyway, allow me to illuminate you. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to lift some examples from Star Trek over the years. It's a franchise that's been around longer than most of us have been alive, so it's probably a good reflection of how writing and character development have changed over the years. First up, let's take a look at The Wrath of Khan from 1982, which is generally regarded as the best Star Trek movie ever made. The basic story is that an aging Admiral Kirk is given command of the Enterprise again when an old enemy hijacks a Federation starship.
Now, what is perhaps important is to recognize that 1982 was when I was... How old was I? I was 19. Was I 19 in 82? Yeah. So, the Critical Drinker, I think he's a generation below me. He wasn't even alive yet, as was most of the audience. But yet he recognizes, he abstracts something out of this.
And uses it to get his hands on a doomsday weapon that can destroy entire planets. Along the way, he also intends to dish out a bit of good old-fashioned payback on Kirk as revenge for leaving him stranded on a barren planet decades earlier. There's a lot going on here in terms of character development, but the central story arc for Kirk is his struggle with getting older. The movie opens up on his 50th birthday.
Ah, see? It's this aging, and this has been dealt with.
And it's clear he's not exactly thrilled about that fact. He's very much a middle-aged man now, stuck in an unrewarding desk job and facing up to the realisation that his best days may be behind him. McCoy even gives him a pair of reading glasses as a birthday gift because he's too proud to admit that his eyesight isn't what it used to be. Overall, it's a pretty universal concept that most people can relate to and empathize.
And again, notice, when you go back to Pageau's point, it's character replacement within the same arena. That's the idea of this viral replacement of the stories. Whereas in the previous generation, well, we're gonna revisit Kirk and see how he's doing with old age, because no matter how young you are, this is a challenge you aspire to meet.
With. I mean, how many of us are trapped in some boring office job we don't enjoy, wishing we could live a life of adventure and endless possibilities? How many of us are getting older and realising we can't do the things we used to do, and that other, younger people are slowly coming up to replace us? Deep down, we all know it's going to happen sooner or later, even if we'd rather not think about it. Now consider a similar scene that Star Trek Beyond from 2016 rips off. Pays tribute to. It's the same basic setup of Kirk and his friend McCoy celebrating his birthday over a quiet drink, and a subdued Kirk reflecting unhappily on where
And a far younger Kirk, of course.
he's at in life. The difference here, though, is that this version of Kirk is 36 years old, and he's in command of a starship out exploring the galaxy. He's literally in the prime of his life, doing the things he enjoys most. He should be loving every single minute of it, but because the movie wants to set him up as a reluctant hero who's thinking about moving on to new things, the best it can come up with is to project the middle-age angst of Wrath of Khan onto a character who's at a completely different stage in life. It doesn't ring true in the slightest, because it's trying to force a situation that can't happen organically. Now consider the ending for Wrath of Khan. With his ship crippled and most of his crew dead, Khan triggers a doomsday device in a last-ditch attempt to take his enemy down with him. The desperate situation forces Spock to sacrifice himself to repair the Enterprise's warp core, allowing them to escape the blast at the cost of his own life. Kirk's forced to watch his best friend die in front of his eyes, unable to help him, and it's interesting to watch his reaction as the realization sinks in. He doesn't scream or cry out or lose control, he just kinda slumps to the ground, devastated and shocked as the camera slowly pans away. And when it's time to lay his friend to rest, he delivers the eulogy with stiff but stoic composure, only wavering once at the very ends.
Abstracting those things out for emulation. This is religion.
Of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most human.
Why? Because he's a grown-ass man and he's the captain of a starship. He's expected to lead by example and hold himself together, whatever his personal feelings, because that's how professional officers conduct themselves. And that little moment when his composure slips becomes all the more poignant, because you know how hard he's trying to hide it. Now let's consider how this same scene plays out in Star Trek Into Darkness. Yeah, I think you begin to see the difference here. Not only does Kirk's death happen in the midst of a ridiculous action scene with starships crashing into cities, buildings getting flattened, and people dying by the tens of thousands, thus giving the audience no time to process it before it's swiftly undone with a bit of cheap Deus Ex Trifica. But it's also very clear that the characters in whatever passes for modern Star Trek very much wear their hearts on their sleeves, running around like frantic lunatics in emergencies, openly discussing personal relationships in front of superior officers, and responding with big emotional outbursts in high-stress situations.
Now, okay, well, why? Well, what's happened in our culture? Well, we want our heroes to be transparent to us, to have their insides be on their outsides. There's more to do with this, but I am out of time right now, so I am going to drop this here and hopefully pick it up again tomorrow, because I think hopefully I've done a lot of reaping right now, and hopefully I can loom some of this stuff together for you.